so you'll be on video now if you say anything. And we're going to jump into chapter 5 about civil rights. Chapter 4 was about civil liberties. Chapter 5 is civil rights, and I told you I would tell you the difference between them. Now, if you have already got a jump start on reading chapter 5, you probably read what the difference was, but in case you didn't, it'll also be here on the slides. Are they up where you can see them? Someone shake your head if they were up. Now they're not.
They were.
Now they should be, right?
Yeah, they are.
Okay. What's the difference? The civil liberties are the first 10 amendments in the Bill of called the Bill of Rights, the original 10. And really, the civil liberties are in the first 9 because the 10th Amendment basically recognizes that the states, remember, have reserve powers. But what the civil liberties are things that we have that are guaranteed in the Constitution, and it protects us from the government. It protects us specifically from the federal government, but also the state government. It limits their power. Think of it as a negative, what the government cannot do, negatives. We already have these liberties. They're going back to Locke and Hobbes and Montesquieu and all those French philosophers. They're natural rights that we were endowed with by our Creator. And so, since we are a land where the law rules and not a president or king or governing body, but the law, it is encoded in our law that these liberties are ours, and they're protected from government abuse and intrusion. Civil rights are kind of based in the 14th Amendment. We'll look at that here in a moment. And so while we think of these as negatives, think of these as positives. These are things that the government must do to ensure that all citizens are equal before the law. So every citizen automatically has these liberties, these rights that were secure, that these rights that started appearing with the 14th Amendment are things that the government must make sure that all citizens are guaranteed. So the government protects us against discrimination. And if, for example, let's say a little town, not any of your towns, of course, but let's just say a little town comes up with a law against, let's just say against Native Americans. The state government, and if the state doesn't do anything, then the federal government needs to do something to make sure that all of the civil rights are guaranteed to all people in that town, including the Native Americans. So this requires government action. here's another way to look at it. The civil liberties limit and prohibit the government powers. The civil rights are rights that the government are to make sure everyone is everyone has equal fairness, equality, and everyone has due process and equal protection under the law. So we're going to talk about the struggle for civil rights. And if you want to follow along with your textbook open before you, it's going to basically begin on page 138. And actually, that's kind of the introductory material. Page 141, and we're going to try to get through page 154. So 141 through 154. And this is the first main section for the chapter, the first big point that you'll have in your chapter's outline, the struggle for civil rights. Any questions? All right, so before we talk about the 14th Amendment, which was adopted in 1868, this is not, however, the beginning of the struggle for civil rights. It goes back before the Civil War. And really, it goes back even before the Revolutionary War. Yes, we have had slaves in America since 1619. At Jamestown, Virginia. It's really ironic because Jamestown is where we had our first local government in which there was a House of Burgesses, and these were people that were elected by, of course, white landowners, but that happened in 1619. So that was kind of the seed of self-government and equality. But at the same time, 1619 is when a ship came to Jamestown with women and slaves, African-American slaves. So yes, we've had slaves since 1619, but at least during the pre-revolutionary time period, the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, there were some abolitionist sentiments. Abolitionists are those who want to abolish slavery. So mostly in the North, however, you had this sentiment that was among the American people, again, mostly in the North, that we needed to get rid of slavery. So there was the sentiment that all people are men and brothers, and all women are equally sisters. Even before the Civil War, there had been at least two political parties that had been formed that were anti-slavery, the Liberty Party and the Free Will Party. The Free Soil Party, sorry. And I'm sure you guys have heard about the Underground Railroad, which really wasn't a railroad track and train, but it was a secret, covert way to smuggle African Americans out of the South and get them to the North. This is before the Civil War. So there was already a struggle for civil rights before the Civil War. Also before the Civil War was the Dred Scott decision, which we've talked about in 1857. Dred Scott had been taken to the North by his owner, and while he was in the North, his owner died, and so he petitioned Congress to be recognized as a free man. But the Supreme Court ruled that Southern slave owners could take their slaves, which was their property, to any part of the United States that they wished. So this really upset the Northerners, because in their eyes, in their mind, it basically said slavery was still legal anywhere in the country. Even though by this time, 1857, pretty much all the northern states had outlawed slavery. And then there were some other things that led up to the Civil War. Things that had to do with slave owners, new states that were being added to the Union. You know, there was the I believe the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically said states above this northern boundary, new states that came in that were north of this boundary would be free states, and then states that came in that were south of this boundary would be slave states. So you have these rumblings because there were debates in Congress, and there was animosity between Southerners and Northerners. You had all this leading up to the Civil War, and really it's the pre-rumblings for civil rights. Well, it all came to a head in 1860. There was when Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union when he became president. And then by the time he took office in January, the full 11 states that made up the South had pulled out of the Union and formed their own confederation. So 1860 to 1864, and that's pretty much when the fighting ended for our purposes, but really the Civil War really didn't end until the beginning of 1865. Interestingly enough, the last Confederate general to surrender was a Native American general named Stand Watie here in Oklahoma, who finally surrendered, I believe, March of 1865 in Fort Gibson. So any of you ever get up to Fort Gibson, and you can go to the the old Fort Gibson Army fort that was in existence during the Civil War. But so Oklahoma has a really unique tie-in to the end of the Civil War. But we fought for 4 years, and at the end of 4 years, I don't know if you guys can see that. I'll make it bigger. There we go. Here is all the casualties from the different conflicts and wars in American history. So we just got out of Afghanistan, right? After 20 years. And I'm sure this number is a little higher now, but let's just say around 7,000 deaths from this 20-year war. Look, compare that to other wars in our history. The War of 1812, 20,000 deaths. The Revolutionary War, 25,000. The Vietnam conflict. Now, I know it really was a war, but it's usually called the Vietnam conflict. 58,000 deaths. World War II, 405 deaths, American deaths. The Civil War has been the war that we have been involved in with the most casualties. 620,000 Americans died, which that makes sense because it was Americans fighting Americans. But the point I want to show you here is this. This one here shows how the blue is the North and the red is the South. Total deaths, the North over 350,000, probably almost 370,000 Northerners died during the Civil War, and about 260,000 died from the South. But the point I want to make, 370,000 Americans died so that African Americans can have freedom. These 260,000, of course, were fighting to defend state rights, which included the right to own slaves. But in our struggle for civil rights, 370,000 Americans lost their lives fighting for African Americans to be free. And the majority of these are white Americans. So if anyone says that all white Americans are prejudiced against blacks, this here alone shows you how untrue that is. Not all whites are prejudiced against other races. And this shows that there was a struggle for civil rights by Americans from our beginning, Americans of all colors, genders, ages, economic backgrounds. And we've got to remember the Declaration of Independence is our ideal that we're shooting for. All people are equal, are created equal and are endowed with their creator with certain unalienable rights. That's the ideal that we're shooting for. When it was first written, white European men were the ones who owned land and had the rights. But it was a different time. It was a different culture, a different mindset. And so we've been working in America so that all people who are American citizens will have that ideal. We've been struggling to make that reality. So that certainly happened during the what we would call the civil rights movement. But we're talking about the overall struggle, which began before the Civil War. And then, of course, during the Civil War, 370,000, over 600,000 Americans died. And now, after the Civil War ended in 1865 and the North prevailed, let me get back to face. April of 1865, General Lee surrenders all of the troops to General Grant at Appomattox. At that moment, is everything hunky-dory? The South, are they like, okay, North, you win, we surrender, we accept slavery, African Americans have equal rights? Is that what happened as soon as that document was signed? Well, if you're still with me, no, that's not what happened. The North had to send federal troops into the southern states, and basically the southern states, until they could get new governments set up, they were under military rule. And they had to enforce, looky here with me. They had to enforce these Civil War amendments that came out after the ending of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. So we had to send in basically military rule to make sure that all the Southerners released their slaves. The 14th Amendment reversed the Dred Scott decision and declared that, now again, this is not a perfect freedom. This is not a perfect obtaining of civil rights. Only African American men over the age of 18 were given the right to vote and be citizens. Actually, the 14th Amendment would be African American men were considered citizens who were eligible for due process and equal protection. So now, in 1868, with the passing of the 14th Amendment, white men and black men, African American men, were considered citizens. So who did that leave out? Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? That left out all women, white and African American, over age 18. They couldn't vote. Often overlooked often overlooked in this is that Native Americans couldn't vote. They didn't have rights. Native Americans over the age of 18. So it's still a limited liberty, but we're moving towards the ideal. So these things were passed, and we had to have military governments in those southern states to enforce that these laws were obeyed. The 15th Amendment allowed African American men to start voting. Now, what was the reality as opposed to what was written down on paper? Well, you'll often see in your history books, your US history books, and US history is usually divided into two sections, especially on the college level. US History 1, beginning until 1865, which is the end of the Civil War. And then US History 2 is usually called Reconstruction until today. Reconstruction is the term given to the time period of 1865 to 1877, when after the Civil War, the North won. The North and the South started to rebuild, reconstruct the South. Because think about it, after the Civil War, the South was devastated. And they were devastated in many ways. They were devastated, infrastructure was devastated, especially the big cities like Atlanta and Charlotte and all the major cities. They had been damaged because of war, because of conflict, fighting. Cities had to be rebuilt. The economy in the South was devastated. Why was that? Anybody want to guess? What was the Southern economy based on? Slavery, slave labor. The Southern economy was agricultural, of course, and the two main crops were cotton and tobacco, but the workforce was the slaves. And so now the slaves have been set free, so the Southern economy has been devastated. And then not only the economy and the infrastructure, but basically the whole morale of the South was devastated. So Reconstruction is the period from 1865 usually to 1877. And you have military governments in the southern states until they can get their new governments up and running. Well, when 1877 rolls around, all of the Northerners go back home and turn it over to the Southerners. Well, you still have a lot of Southerners, and especially the plantation owners, who are bitter about losing the war. And what they start doing is they start discriminating against African Americans in the South. They start passing laws referred to as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws that were discriminating against African Americans. One of the key Supreme Court decisions during this time, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Which upheld state laws that basically said that states could separate the races, African Americans from white Americans, as long as they had equal facilities. So for example, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the issue was railroad cars. You had cars that were designated for whites, and you had cars that were designated for blacks or African Americans. And the Supreme Court upheld those state laws that as long as there were separate but equal facilities for the races, then that was lawful. One of the main issues was, however, that while you might have a railroad car for blacks and a railroad car for whites, the whites might have a much cleaner, fancier car than the African Americans. So in a sense, it was equal, but it wasn't. And this permeated into the school systems. And even before Plessy versus Ferguson, you had state laws that were separating the races as far as them being mixed socially. But as long as you had public facilities that were equal, it was okay. Even as far back as 1875, when we're still technically in Reconstruction, there was a Civil Rights Act by Congress that was passed. But the Supreme Court struck it down, saying that private citizens did not have to provide equal treatment. It was only in the public sphere. So this is the period after the Civil War and after the Civil War amendments. It's actually kind of the fourth point, the fourth subpoint in your textbook on page 144 and 145, where the Supreme Court, Civil Rights in the Supreme Court is the name of the section. But the Supreme Court basically upheld the separate but equal philosophy. Now, during this time, you started having groups, and this is your fifth subpoint on page 145. You started having subgroups start to organize for equality. So you had groups like the NAACP start to crop up. The NAACP was organized in 1909, and it was a group that would use the legal system, so the courts, to bring about change, promote change, and to see change be done. So the NAACP using the court system. You also had women's groups cropping up around the country. It wasn't just African Americans that were striving for equal rights, civil rights, but it was women's groups too. Women wanted the right to vote, that is suffrage. And so you had groups like Just Government League start to crop up and demand the right to vote. As far back as 1848, and this is in your textbook on the women's rights movement on page 142. It's really subsection 2. Women's rights movement had started before the Civil War. Before the Civil Rights, ladies, you might listen to this. Before the Civil War, not only did women not have the right to vote, but there was a law known as coverture doctrine, which basically said husbands owned all property, that wives could not own any of the property. It was all owned by the husbands. So you had this kind of stuff going on. And so even before the Civil War, you had women leaders trying to get momentum for women's rights. And so in 1848, you'll see there as you read your chapter, there was a convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And during this convention, there was a declaration of sentiments written, which was patterned after the Declaration of Independence. Listen to some of the words of the Declaration of Sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. So you see the language of the Declaration of Independence in this Declaration of Sentiments. But by the time we get to the period after the Civil War, women's groups are starting to crop up, and there's more and more women's groups. Out in the West, you know, we continued to have more states being added to our union. And the states that were being added out in the West, let me point this to my map here. The states that were being added out here in the West, since they were brand new state governments, and they were quite a distance away from Washington, D.C., these state governments started passing laws allowing women to vote. So even before the 1920 amendment, or the amendment in 1920 that allowed women to vote all across the country, you had states like Wyoming and Utah and Idaho passing laws allowing women to vote in those states. And then, of course, you had other groups cropping up later, like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which Martin Luther King was a part of. You had the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, and you had the Student Violent Coordinating Committee. And you had several of these groups cropping up during this time, before World War II and after World War II. And so we'll end right there, and we'll pick up with civil rights during the Second World War and after. So do you have any questions for me? Well, you have a great weekend, and all of you guys are under 20 years old, right?
Correct.
So I would encourage you. Tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And if you don't know very much about 9/11, I would encourage you to spend an hour or two just kind of researching it and making yourself more acquainted with it. Because the war we just got out of was a result of 9/11. And so this war that's been going on for all of your life, the longest war in American history, tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of the catalyst for it. So let me encourage you to do some personal research on it. Otherwise, have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.
Bye, Mr. Baines.
Bye, Mr. Bain.
See you later. Bye-bye.